Welcome to What One Thing, a smart meetings podcast where we ask successful people what make all the difference in their life and career so you can learn from their journeys and spark your own growth. Today's guest is someone whose insights have completely changed the way I think about behavior and communication. I first met her when she took the stage at NMOA conference in Boston, and I've been inspired ever since by the way she helps us understand why people say yes. Nancy Harhut is the Chief Creative Officer at HBT Marketing, where she blends behavioral science with creative strategy to inspire action. Named one of the 10 most fascinating people in B2B marketing and a top 100 creative influencer, Nancy has helped brands like Nationwide, H&R Block, and Great West Life achieve record-breaking results. She's the award-winning author of Using Behavioral Science in Marketing, now translated into 9 languages, and a global keynote speaker who's captivated audiences from South by Southwest to Stockholm. Nancy's work reminds us that the best marketing and the best events are built on understanding how people think, feel, and act. Nancy, welcome to What One Thing.
Devon, thank you so much. I am pumped to be here.
I'm so excited to get you here. Your insights have been such a fascinating journey to follow. And every time we get to hear you speak, it's like, oh, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Why didn't I think of that? But the way you present it just helps connect what feels like natural dots. So for listeners who might not know as much about your journey, what first drew you into this fascinating space? How did you discover behavioral science and how that could unlock this world of communication and connection?
Sure. So that's a great question. And it's kind of funny. A mentor of mine actually recommended a book, Robert Cialdini's Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. And it took me a little bit to even get around to reading it. But once I read it, I'm reading it, I'm highlighting things and writing margin notes. And I'm thinking about the clients that I'm doing work for. I was trying to get subscribers for the Boston Globe. I was trying to get people to increase their insurance for an insurance company. All these, different, very real marketing challenges that I was working on at the time. And I was like, that could work. I could test that. That might be applicable. And so that's what I started doing. And as I began to test some of these tactics and techniques, I saw that they were working. And that just set me in that direction. And I never looked back. When we talk about behavioral science, some people are like, well, what exactly is that? And it's very simply just the study of how people behave. But more specifically, it's why people do what they do and how marketers and salespeople and business people can get their audience to do more of what we'd like them to do. That's the beauty of it. And when you start to understand how people really make decisions, you're in a much better place to influence those decisions. And when I kind of stumbled upon, through the good graces of my mentor, that book and this line of thinking, it was amazing. It just really made the work that I do for my clients that much better.
I love that. And I know that you shared some really impressive results once you discovered this and had that aha light bulb moment and were able to compare them. Can you, talk to us some of the brands that you've achieved results for? Is there a story or a campaign that still kind of makes you smile when you added your aha moment and you tried it and it worked?
Yeah, there's an interesting one, Devon, because I was reading the book and I was testing things here and there. And for the most part, I wasn't really saying anything. I was using what I knew worked, in terms of marketing best practices, and then what I suspected would help what I was doing work even better based on what I was reading about behavioral science. And I was just kind of quietly watching and it seemed to be working. I got recruited to work at this new agency and I was very excited and I get there. And not long after I got there, they mentioned that their biggest client was kind of considering making a move. And I'm like, oh, that would have been nice to know prior to coming, but okay, whatever. These things happen. That's the business, right? So I thought, okay, we want you to move the needle with our numbers. This is we're thinking about moving, tell us why we shouldn't. And I thought, all right, this is our chance to kind of put a stake in the ground and say, we use marketing best practices coupled with behavioral science. Now, granted, I was brand new. I was their new creative director, but they were looking at me like, all right, what are we going to do to keep this client? And I was like, all right, I think we have something new that we can trot out, something that they probably haven't heard of and something that we think is going to work, something I certainly think is going to work. And we did an assignment for them. And the idea was we were trying to convince dentists to increase their life insurance. Now, I know, Devon, you're thinking I just lost every listener because Nancy's talking about dentist and life insurance. Like, does it
together?
Because life changes. Maybe you have children or your income grows or it decreases or whatnot. Anyway, you're supposed to, but no amount of rational arguments with the audience was getting them to change their behavior. They're like, I bought it. I don't even need to talk about this or think about this again. And so what we did is we used something from Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. and it's called the pull of the magnetic middle. So what we did is we showed people a graph, and we said at the one end of the graph is $0 of insurance, least you could possibly have, right? None. And at the other end was 3 million. That was the most this particular company sold. And then we said, you are here. And we put a little dot on that graph showing people where they were. And we were very careful to choose people who had less than 1.5 million. So it was less than half the amount. And it wasn't hard to do because many people fell into that category. So what would happen is they would look at the graph, and before they even read any of the arguments about what they should do and why they should do it, they looked at the graph and they saw that they were left of center. They felt like they were lagging behind. And none of us likes to feel that way, right? We don't like to feel like we're behind. Often we don't like to feel like we're way out on the bleeding edge either. We feel comfortable in the middle. And when you look quickly and you're like, I'm not in the middle, it feels disconcerting. And so we didn't think people were going to say, oh my gosh, we need to have $3 million of insurance. But we did think that they would say, you know what, I should buy some more. I should scooch closer to the middle. And Devon, that's exactly what happened. We had a 459% lift in sales, not inquiries,
Wow.
not calls to an agent, sales. And it was that use of the magnetic middle that did it. We cemented the client relationship. They remained our client for years and years and years after that. Together, we created many successful communications using behavioral science and marketing best practices. So it's one of my fondest stories in terms of client successes. There are many that I can point to, but this one was a very interesting one because there was a lot riding on it. It was one of the first times I kind of came public and said, all right, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. And it definitely marked a turning point for us.
I wish you all could have seen my eyebrows. I think they shot past my hairline when you said 459%, which was different from the expression of, we're going to talk about dentists and insurance for a minute. And I was like, Nancy, where is this going? We need to know.
I know,
the
I'm
full
sorry.
completion. No, it's great though. I mean, at the very least, you probably reminded most of our listeners to at least look at their life insurance policy and make sure that it's updated. But at the same time, I'm thinking about what you said and that simple story of, I showed you where you were in comparison to others, and that psychological feeling of, oh, I feel like I'm left behind. So I immediately want to take action, irregardless of what the action is or the requests or everything else that you had prepared in terms of argument for behavior. You focused in on their feelings of where they were as a whole, and that inspired action. It's just a fascinating way to put your testing something new, you're trying it out, and to see that something as simple as showing people where they were in comparison inspired so much action.
Yeah. I mean, if you had maybe come to the client ahead of time and said, this is what we're going to do, we're going to solve your problem with a graph, they might have laughed at us, So, we didn't say, hey, here's our big plan. We just put together the communication and put it into the marketplace. And then when it worked, we peeled back the layers of the onion and said, all right, let us tell you why we did what we did and what we believe is driving the success of the package. And then, of course, it was like, awesome, let's start doing this for every communication we put out there, every email, every direct mail piece, every social media post. We want some of this behavioral science thinking that you're talking about. So it worked out really well. But, you use an interesting term, Devon, you said feel. And feelings they're what drive people's behavior, right? Like we make decisions in B2B and in B2C, both for emotional reasons. We make the decisions for emotional reasons, and then we justify them with the rational reasons. And when salespeople, business people, marketing people understand that, it allows us to create better, more effective communications. It just leads to more success.
I love that. I'm writing down emotional first, rational later. And I think maybe we don't even realize as individuals why I made that decision. Like I can go back and say, maybe that was why, or you make the emotional decisions like, well, I deserved the cookie because I've been so good today and I walked that extra mile, and I'm going to rationalize myself into the cookie. I'm going to rationalize myself into going out with the girls or, having that, taking the vacation, right? Anything that we just feel first and we rationalize later. But I love how you're talking about action and driving action. And in the events world, we talk a lot about behavior change, designing for behavior change. And I love that, we're talking about you're still driving an action with your psychology plus marketing best practices. Can you see where the correlation is between how some of us in the industry are still trying to, with experiences, drive behavior, how that correlates to what you're doing with your B2C and B2B marketing to sort of create the same results? And maybe how could we marry the two together?
Absolutely. We're talking about behavioral science, and, that is all about influencing people's behavior. Why do people do what they do, and how can we get them to do more of what we want? And so when we design experiences, just like when we design marketing communications, we need to think about these decision defaults that people rely on. Because one of the things, that business people consider when they're thinking about their target audience is that, oh, these are really smart people. They're professionals. Maybe it's a B2B environment, or at least they're college educated, or, they're just smart people, and, they make good decisions. And if I give them the right information, they're going to make the right decision. And time again, we've seen that information alone is rarely what changes behavior. And what we need to do is we need to craft our customer experiences. We need to craft our marketing messages to take advantage of the way people really think, the way they really decide, which is relying on these decision-making shortcuts. So anything we can do to capture somebody's attention, that's the first goal. Deliver information in a way that's understandable, that's our second goal. Make sure that people remember the information, that has a lasting impact, that's our third goal. And then our fourth goal is to get people to take some kind of action. Anything we can do to hit those four goals, that's going to increase our success. And again, whether it's designing an event, whether it's designing an experience at the event, whether it's designing the marketing messages that are going to go out to people, those are the things we need to think about. And there's a huge amount of research that behavioral scientists have done that talks about ways that we can capture somebody's attention, that talks about ways that we can create an experiment or experience rather that people are going to remember, that talks about ways that we can communicate in such a fashion that people are actually going to easily understand it. And certainly there's a lot out there that talks about how do we motivate behavior? Just like you were saying, it could be how somebody feels. It could be not wanting to be left behind. It could be doing what other people are doing, but there are all these things that maybe aren't the most logical or rational, but these are the things that motivate the behavior. And so there's something called the peak end rule, speaking of experiences, where we think, people have this wonderful memory, and we remember everything, every detail from start to finish in chronological order. And we like to think that's how we remember things and that's how other people remember things. But scientists have proven that's not the case. And often what happens is we remember two things. We remember the peak experience, the thing that was the most salient, the most meaningful, that had the most impact. And we remember the final experience. So anything that we can do when we're designing experiences to really focus on those two things, to make sure that there's one really incredible high point, and to make sure at the very end, there's something that's incredibly memorable, that surprises people or delights people, that really harnesses this idea of the peak end rule and makes that experience so much more memorable, so much more meaningful for the participants. I was out for dinner the other day at a restaurant, and at the end of dinner, the server comes over with this giant pink cotton candy. I guess apparently everyone who dined there would just get one. That was the way they said, thank you, and thank you for dining with us, and have a good rest of the evening. But it was memorable. You weren't expecting it. It wasn't on the menu, and kids and adults who are kids at heart, all, were like, we're loving it, It's like, cool, pink. Who doesn't like pink or blue, rather, cotton candy? Like, who doesn't like that? So I thought it was a wonderful example for them of the peak end rule, like ending on something that was memorable, that people were going to talk about, that was going to color their experience. But we can take a page out of that as we're designing any kind of conference or meeting or event, right? Little something at the end that people didn't see coming.
Yeah. I mean, the cotton candy is definitely an improvement on a take home and a tinfoil swan. That's for sure. But, I'm looking at the real synchronicities between how we capture attention and how we drive behavior, and even how we have to work on the marketing design hand in hand with the experience design to ensure that we're setting those expectations correctly, that we understand how to at least get the information first that get them to drive the ultimate behavior, which is to register and to come or to pay the ticket or to join the event, etc. So let me make sure for our decision defaults, I've got us right. So we need to capture attention first, which can be both in marketing and when someone arrives at the event, both applicable. We need info that's understandable, right? So again, our know before you goes, but also when you arrive on site, is the information easily understandable? We need to remember, I like to use the word resonance. Is it resonant? Are you creating something that lasts? Again, am I remembering the marketing messages, and am I remembering those experiences? And then, of course, taking action. So whether that's taking action to come or taking action to register next or to tell a friend or to fill out the survey. I love the peak end rule. everyone remembers what happens last. So if you cannot remember cotton candy rule, that's what we'll call it from now on, the cotton candy rule, and on something sweet, surprise and delight.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's a perfect summary. You absolutely got it. And I've seen, different things like when we're trying to get somebody's attention, I've seen events. There was one where they sent out an email saying, do you play Wordle? You can get a discount at our event. And you're not expecting that, so it surprises you. And because it surprises you, it focuses you, and you pay attention. You're like, well, let me find out more about this event, and then, I've seen it play all the way out to actually getting people to register. And, what makes you register? Well, I've seen some conferences say, well, this is a list of the companies or the attendees that have already registered. And when you see yourself there, whether it's, because it's someone who is a peer of yours or someone who has the next job that you want to get or has the next title that you want to get, you're like, gee, if they're there, I better be there too. And, these are the ways, people make decisions. I was recently reading an email from a conference and they said, why are your competitors going to be at this forum? Because every day they want to outmaneuver and outsmart you. And that just surprised me because, you would think it was going to be something like, well, why are your competitors going to be here? So they can learn the latest insights and most, innovative practices, the kind of thing that most people would say, but they twisted it and they were like, no, it's because your competitors are going to be there because every day they're trying to outmaneuver and outsmart you. And you're like, holy crow, they're not wrong about this, and,
right.
And if I don't show up and they're there, they're going to come away with, ways to do that. And I'm going to be left out. And it goes back to emotion again. They're going to have the upper hand. They're going to have an edge on me. I don't want to feel that way. So I'd better register. So, when we think about that, it's the attention, it's communicating clearly so people understand what they're going to get out of this. It's doing it in a memorable way because sometimes you don't have the opportunity to register immediately, but you need to remember to go back to it. Or the experience needs to be memorable so that once you leave, you're still talking about it, and then, as you said, getting that action, whether it's getting them to open the communication, the email or the direct mail piece or the social media piece and engage with it, or to register or to recommend a friend or to, give up a little bit of data about themselves so that you can, personalize that experience more so when they're actually on premise, any of these actions we need people to take, we really need to think about, all right, how do we motivate them? And behavioral science helps us do that. Not that we can't do it without behavioral science, but we do it so much better when we understand these decision-making shortcuts people rely on, these cognitive biases that we all have. It just makes us better business people, better event marketers, better planners, just better communicators.
Yep. Bold statements yield bold actions and, keeps you aware and driving that. So speaking of bold statements and bold actions, our favorite question here on What One Thing is, what's the one thing that's made all the difference in your life and career?
Well, I would have to say it was discovering how powerful behavioral science can be. I was doing pretty well in a marketing and advertising career. I was, mastering the best practices. But when I started to experiment with behavioral science and saw the difference that it made, like that was it. That was the absolute, turning point for me. And it led to ultimately my starting my own agency. It led to the opportunity to write the book. It attracted a lot more client business than I think, we would have gotten ordinarily, because I found something that really worked. I tested it. I found that it did in fact work and it could be beneficial for my clients. And so that started to attract people and the business started to grow and my speaking opportunities began to expand. And then the book came along. And so I would have to say it was discovering behavioral science.
It's fantastic. And, we say a lot that leaders are learners, and diving into that additional learning really was, a cornerstone in this new journey, this new path that you took towards all of this success with the book and the speaking career. So thinking about though how much your work has evolved since 1989 and the path that you've taken, and we're living in a different age now where we're trying to sort of break through in the attention economy. How have you continued to evolve and modernize your approach as you see the evolution of how to get people's attention?
Sure. So, marketing and advertising are constantly changing, constantly. So if you're going to succeed in this business, you have to, be a student of the craft. You have to be open to whatever new is coming along. You want to try to get out ahead of consumer trends. At the very least, you want to ride along with those trends. So, for me, it's open to what's going on. It's being that student of the craft. It's constantly learning, reading, attending conferences, talking to my peers, testing, just doing my own test and learn scenarios where, You find something, you think, all right, this might work. I'm going to put it out there and let's see. Let's do an A/B split and see which message does better or which gets, the most response. But the business itself changes so much. There's a new channel or there's a new property or there's a new way to segment people. There's just constant change. And, if you're going to stay in this business, you just have to stay on top of it. And if you love what you do, that's an easy enough thing to do. It's a lot of work because, everything's just changing so much and so quickly. But again, if you enjoy it, it's not that hard to go along for the ride.
That old saying that if you love what you do, you don't work a day, you don't work a day in your life, except for you work harder every day, but it increases your craft, as you say, a student of the craft. Nancy, I love that you've said it a couple of times. You got to test and learn, but you've never used the word fail. It's a really interesting switch in how you approach trying something different to learn the results. But you've never said, I tried it and it didn't work. I tried it and it failed. You try and learn. Can you give us some permission to try and learn, or maybe a way to open up our clients' minds to this test and learn sort of mentality?
Sure. I mean, what we like to say is there's no failed test because you always learn something. So you start with a hypothesis. I'm going to try this kind of message, or I'm going to try this channel, or I'm going to try this offer with my, prospects, and we're going to see if it works. And maybe it will. Maybe it's going to work better than the last thing we did, or maybe it's going to tie the last thing we did, or maybe it's not going to do as well as the last thing we did. But I come from a background, ages ago, I was in direct marketing. That's what they called it, right? And it was a huge test and learn, environment, because we weren't trying to change people's attitudes or their awareness. We were trying to get them to take an action, whether it was to pick up the phone or walk into a store or, click a button. But it's all about getting that action. And so you knew pretty quickly, did it do better than the last thing or did it not? Did it do better than the thing we tested against it or not? And there's no magic wand. Nobody has the answers. If we had the answers, life would be a lot easier. We'd all have private islands in the Caribbean and, but we'd
probably run out of islands, right?
We'd run out of islands. Exactly. Yeah. But anyone who tells you, I know what's going to work, don't believe them, because we can't possibly, we can have a good hunch, a good hypothesis, but until we put it out in the marketplace and test it, it's my word against your word. And what we need to do is we need to let our audience come back and tell us. Now, sometimes things that we don't think are going to work, that sound kind of counterintuitive, turn out to work. And that's great, but we don't know unless we put them in the marketplace and we test them. And we want to start to benchmark what does better. A lot of the clients that I work with have what they call a suite of rotating controls. So maybe it's 3 or 4 or 5 different emails that they constantly rotate through so people don't get tired of them, but they're the best performing ones, or maybe they're direct mail packages. But it's this idea that these are the ones that perform the best. And we know that eventually things start to fatigue, right? They start to wear out a little bit. And so you're always testing and you want something in the wings that you can slip in and say, okay, of these 3, this third one is kind of not doing as well as it used to, but oh, look, we just found one that beat it. That's going to be our new third one. So it's just this idea that we have to be inquisitive. We have to, stay on our toes, and we just have to keep trying, whether it's a new offer, whether it's a new message, whether it's a new medium, to just stay on top of results and try to keep optimizing it and maximizing it. And by definition, not everything we put out there is going to be the winning formula. Not everything is going to get a positive answer, but it does give us an answer. Like, okay, that doesn't work. And if it doesn't work now, it doesn't mean that it might not work in the future. Just like something that's working, that didn't work in the past may now work if I try it in this environment, in this context. But so we constantly have to be testing.
Nancy, I love what you just said, because it is the antithesis of this is how we've always done it. And I hope my fellow event professionals are perking up, because it's the one thing that, planners and designers go up against is this is how we've always done it. And it's a very difficult thing to undo. It's like, well, just because it worked 5 years ago doesn't mean it's still applicable. Or just because you tried an idea 5 years ago and it didn't work doesn't mean it's not the right idea for right now. So this idea that successful marketing employs test and learn, great hypotheses, having a couple of different options to avoid fatigue, versus if you do the same thing in your marketing over and over and over again, it will have diminishing returns. And yet looking at our in-person opportunities, we keep doing the same thing over and over and over again and wondering why it's not working as well as it did when we first do it. So I love that you drew the parallels at the beginning of what works in terms of creating resonance and driving action. But now we're starting to see the difference between how you are successful in trying and learning and having a couple of different options versus we're just beating the same formats over and over and over again until they're falling apart.
Yeah. It's tough. I don't want to discount what we know works. I mean, if we've been using something for a while, it works. That's great. It took us a while to get there. And, so I'm not suggesting we throw everything out, but a little bit of testing, we carve out, maybe 10% of the email list and we try this new approach and we see, is it doing well? Great. Now let's roll it out to more. If not, well, the old thing was going to 90% of our people anyway. So we've kind of minimized our risk, but, nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? And we're never going to do better if we just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And in fact, it will probably start to become less and less effective. So there's a way to, I think, control the testing so that we're not disrespecting all the institutional knowledge. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel every time we go out there because that's inefficient. But if you have a managed test program where you know what you're doing and you're managing your risk, but you're also putting enough out there so that you can learn something, that's the way to future success. It really is.
Well, you heard it here first, everyone. Nancy said we don't have to do it exactly the same way we've always done it, but it doesn't mean we have to recreate the wheel. So just putting it out there, giving ourselves permission to try something new. Nancy, I can't believe how fast this conversation has gone. It always seems that we get to these last moments too quickly. And I know you and I could continue the conversation about these parallels forever, but wanted to draw your attention to just one final question before we say goodbye. And that is, what keeps you curious and inspired after doing this for so many years?
Well, it goes back to, I think, really being fascinated by human behavior. I love being able to help my clients get the behavior that they're looking for from their customers and prospects. And it's, as we were just saying, it's not always the same answer every time. Very often it's something different. People change, they evolve. And so finding that thing that's going to make the difference in the moment for a client is just really exciting to me. It never gets old. There's always something to learn. I love working in marketing because you can show up at a cocktail party and know a little bit about a lot of different things as opposed to a real lot about only one thing. And, so I've learned about insurance and dentists, but telemarketing and education and healthcare and fast food restaurants, the list goes on, not-for-profits. The list goes on and on and on. So you end up learning so much about so many things. And, for someone who is a student of the craft, that's just a wonderful thing. That's what keeps me motivated. There's just there's no end to the things that might potentially get somebody to take an action. And I love just uncovering each and every one of those.
Nancy, thank you so much for inspiring us, for giving us permission to try and learn, not test and fail, to try and learn forward, to avoid fatigue, and to look at those decision defaults as a way to continue to capture attention and drive behavior and create some resonance. It's such a pleasure to have you share your wisdom with us and your warmth and the science, a little bit of the science that helps us create meaningful connections. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on What One Thing, a Smart Meetings podcast where every story sparks inspiration for your own journey. Until next time, keep creating, keep connecting, and keep sparking change.
Smart Meetings What One Thing was produced by Bright Business Media. Visit smartmeetings.com to subscribe to your daily dose of inspiration.